11, ya me pasé. Buenas tardes a todos, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. Vamos a seguir el día de hoy con nuestros seminarios titulados Los ecólogos de Krebs sobre la regulación de poblaciones. Yo soy Carlos Galindo Leal, director general de Comunicación de la Ciencia en la Comisión Nacional para el Conocimiento y Uso de la Biodiversidad. Mil gracias por estar aquí, escríbanos en el chat, pongan de dónde nos están viendo. Hemos tenido pues mucha compañía en estos seminarios de muchos países, nos encanta ver de dónde nos están viendo. Este es el cuarto seminario. Para los que vieron los previos tres, tenemos ya algunas de las presentaciones en video y en PDF en la página que desarrollamos para estos seminarios, que son 6. Este es el cuarto. Ustedes pueden bajar ya las presentaciones en inglés o en español. Y la presentación de este seminario de Stan Boutin ya está disponible en este sitio web. La serie se trata de la regulación de poblaciones, ya que esta es la base de la conservación, manejo y restauración de las poblaciones. Como mencioné en algunos de los seminarios anteriores, somos muy afortunados por tener a este grupo de investigadores, los ecólogos de Krebs, porque son líderes mundiales en la ecología de poblaciones. Como ya se han dado cuenta en los seminarios previos, tienen una mente crítica, un enfoque experimental, hacen experimentos de campo en ecología, lo cual no es nada sencillo, y tienen le dan mucha importancia a la investigación y a la educación. Les voy a presentar al investigador de hoy, quien es el doctor Stan Boutin. Es un ecólogo canadiense, es profesor emérito de Ecología de Poblaciones en la Universidad de Alberta, en Canadá. Es codirector del Instituto de Monitoreo de la Biodiversidad de Alberta y también ha sido reconocido en la Real Sociedad de Canadá y recibió una medalla, la medalla Miroslav Romanovsky, por sus contribuciones a la resolución de los aspectos científicos de los problemas ambientales. Su investigación trata de los sistemas depredador-presa, incluyendo lobos y caribús, liebres y linces, y también tiene un programa de investigación sobre las ardillas rojas en el Yukon. Ha escrito más de 250 publicaciones. Tan solo sus publicaciones sobre las ardillas son más de 70. Su investigación aplicada la realiza para proporcionar información y herramientas para que se tomen decisiones que sean informadas ecológicamente. Su doctorado lo hizo bajo el doctor Anthony Sinclair, que también es un renombrado ecólogo de UBC, y de ahí siguió con el equipo de Charlie Krebs. Voy a hablarles ahora en inglés y a presentar a Stan Boutin. Welcome to the series entitled Krebs Ecologist on Population Regulation. Please write your name and place in the Facebook chat so we know a bit of who is watching and from where. This is the fourth seminar of the series. You can see in the previous 3 in the webpage that we have developed. You can also download the presentations in English and Spanish. And the presentation for today is already available in the website that you will see in our chat. This series on population regulation, it's very important because it is the basis for conservation, management, and restoration of populations. As I mentioned before, we are very lucky to have this group of researchers, Krebs ecologists, because they are world leaders in population ecology. And as you have already realized from previous seminars, they all have very critical minds. They use an experimental approach, field experiments, which are very difficult in ecology, and they have a strong commitment to research and education. And well, I will introduce today to Dr. Stan Boutin. He's a Canadian ecologist Recently, he became Professor Emeritus of Population Ecology in the University of Alberta. He's co-director of the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, and he's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and received the Miroslav Romanovsky Medal for his significant contributions to the resolution of scientific aspects of environmental problems. His research is very diverse, but it deals with predator-prey systems, including wolves and caribou, snowshoe hares and lynx, white-tailed deer, and red squirrels and pines. With over, he has over 250 scientific publications. Just his project of the Kluane red squirrel since 1987 has produced over 70 scientific publications. His applied research works to provide information and tools to make ecologically informed decisions. I met Stan many moons ago at UBC, where he was a student, and we spent some time up in the north and had very, very interesting times living in the wilderness of Kluane Lake. Thank you, Stan, and we are really pleased to have you here. It's a great honor.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. I'll just see if I can share my screen here. And hopefully you should be able to see my slides. Does it look all right?
Yeah, it looks all right.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much, Carlos. I really appreciate being given this opportunity, and I thank all of you that are sitting in today and listening to this talk. The title I gave you was Predator-Prey Dynamics in Canada's Boreal Forest, but the reality of all of that is if you're talking about vertebrate predator-prey dynamics, you really can't detach that from the 10-year snowshoe hare cycle, because this fundamental relationship between the snowshoe hare and its predators, particularly the lynx, really form the core that affects so many other aspects of the boreal forest ecosystem. So although we're talking predator-prey dynamics, it's really about the 10-year cycle. So lots of parallels here to think about. So Charlie gave a very interesting talk last week, if you were able to sit in and listen to it, about his work researching vole cycles and the causes of these 4 to 6 year fluctuations in all of these little small animals that live in these forested and grasslands environments. And today there's going to be a lot of parallels to that, but we move up into quite a different system. And in many ways, the conclusions that we've come up with are going to be somewhat different than what he's been able to discover with the vole work. But the parallel is that basically, while he's done all this vole work, he talked about all along, he's also been tackling this very challenging question of what causes the changes in numbers of snowshoe hares and lynx to go up and down every 10 years. Carlos referred to Krebs's ecologists, and if you haven't read this book by Peter Crowcroft on Elton's ecologists, you should do so. It's a very interesting read, and it gives a history of an individual, Charles Elton, who had enormous influence on ecology, not only in population ecology, but lots of other components as well. And the parallels between his career and Charlie's are striking, to say the least. And if you were to look at all of the people that interacted with Charlie, he trained directly, etc., that came out of the Institute of Animal Resource Ecology, where both Carlos and I got our degree, you'd see just how far his influence has reached. But today what I'd like to do is basically give you an outline of 40 years of research on snowshoe hares, and I'll spend the first 30 minutes talking about the sort of the fundamental work that Charlie started, but a number of us have helped carry on over the years, that have looked at the basic core of the hare work, and then spend the last 15 minutes looking at some of the very recent work we've done that We dusted off some old ideas, applied some new techniques to what we currently have available for us to actually get at some of the questions that I think have been left unanswered by the work we've done so far. So I'll get rolling with this, and we go right back to Elton's book. And even during his time, he was extremely interested in these bizarre cycles between lynx and hares in Canada's north. And we have very good records of this because the Hudson's Bay Fur Company trapped these animals, particularly the lynx, and kept meticulous records of the numbers of pelts that they brought in each year and then shipped over to Europe to make all of the sort of fur coats and things that were a sign of the times. So he was totally enamored with this, even though he spent part of his time, as Charlie pointed out to you, setting mouse traps in his high quality machine. He also was very interested in this component and was wondering what was the driver of these sorts of 10-year cycles rather than these shorter term vole cycles. If you fast forward to some more recent data, I just show you 5 cycles here that we've been able to follow, and just have a look. We just have hair density plotted on the y-axis, and starting back in the mid 70s right up to now, we've been getting good population estimates of these hares in this area. And you can see right away major changes in numbers, top to bottom, peak to decline, or peak to low. Not every cycle has the same maximum peak numbers, but in each instance, the numbers drop down to very, very low levels. It's hard to get a feeling for just how big those changes are. So I'll try and just tell you a little bit of a story. So this is Yasmin Marjak, a recent PhD student we had in the lab. And we trapped these hares in live catch traps to mark them and put radio collars on them. And if Yasmin was working at the peak of the hare cycle, at the top of it, we have a grid that has 80 traps on it. And she and friends would go out and set those traps in the evening, come back and check them the following morning, and virtually every trap would have a snowshoe hare in it. So we would handle those animals, and then we'd set again a second time and revisit the next day. And again, the traps would be completely full, and at least half of those individuals would be brand new characters. So that's what she'd have to face, a very busy person in the peak. And then in the low phase, just where we are right now, actually, I have a crew up north, and they've set all the traps a couple of nights ago, and they caught all of 2 animals. So that's the magnitude of the changes in numbers of these little characters that we're talking about. It's striking. You can't miss it if you live in this part of the world. And so clearly it's a tantalizing thing to try and understand what's driving those changes. So let's start at the beginning. And not only Elton was interested in these changes, but so was a fellow by the name of Lloyd Keith. And he wrote a book about the 10-year cycle in Canada. And he summarized it quite nicely here, that basically, if you were an ecologist, a population ecologist studying these organisms in this forest, you had to think about this 10-year cycle, and it behooved everyone to take on this great challenge of what is the cause of these changes in numbers, because understanding that would obviously have big implications to understanding how one might deal with conservation issues in this area. So the questions for hare cycles, very much like vole cycles, they're pretty obvious ones. And we followed a very similar pattern. You'll see Charlie's way of doing things very much imprinted on all of the sorts of things I'm going to talk about. And as he pointed out before, for the vole cycles, before one can do much, you need to have high quality demographic information. So just how do births and deaths, immigration and emigration change over the cycle? But then once you have that, you get to the interesting nitty gritty of what might be the mechanisms that go on or change behind these 10-year fluctuations. What stops the increase? What it sets that peak density? Why does it higher in some cycles and relative to others? And maybe $1 million question is what in fact triggers the stop in increase and the crash in the population? And then also important is how does it turn back around? What factors in fact change to allow that to take place? And then overall, why 10 years? Why not 6 years, 4 to 6 years like the voles? So Charlie moved to University of British Columbia in the early 70s and was getting his program up and running and was busy still working on voles at that time. But just by chance, he ended up getting a contract with the park in the far north of the country, a place called Kluane, to go and survey the small mammals there. And that was, I guess, quite a turning point. I asked Charlie what made him switch to snowshoe hares from voles, and he said that contract and seeing the Yukon and quickly realizing that the big story in town was not the voles, but the snowshoe hares, made him start to think about seeing whether he could tackle this question and obviously see whether there were strong parallels in the potential drivers of the changes in numbers of these animals relative to voles. So he enlisted the help of two other scientists at UBC at that time, Jamie Smith and Tony Sinclair, and this became the UBC crowd, as known by many people in the field, and the research area was the Kluane Lake Yukon site, way up in the north, some 5,500 kilometers away from Mexico City, north of the 60th parallel. Let's talk a little bit, though, in terms of background about the characters in this story or in this play. And the main one is definitely the snowshoe hare, Lepus americanus. So unlike what you have in Mexico, where you have a really nice diversity of rabbits and hares, this is the only hare species in the Yukon. It's the dominant, the only player. It's a highly seasonal environment, as you well imagine, and for 8 to 9 months of the year, these animals are living on the shrubby vegetation in the area. They clip the twigs and consume the ends of these shrubby plants to get their food throughout the winter period. They're only about 1,500 grams, and they're a very short-lived beast. Most of them don't breed more than a single time in their lives before they get snuffed out for various reasons. They have amazing reproductive capacity, as you would expect with a rabbit or a hare, up to 4 litters each year. So, and with 4 to 8 young in each of those litters. So roughly 20 young per female could be produced in good years. Those first litters are born in about mid-May, and then about every 35 days after that, they produce another litter. So the last one could be born well into September in good years. The young are born with their eyes open, basically independent. The mother visits these poor little characters about 15 minutes a day, and that is it. They're left to their own devices thereafter. And so it's a very challenging life for these youngsters when they're small. So it's high output, low parental care in these systems. Predators in the system, there are a number of them, but probably 4 main players. The main one is the Canadian lynx, but also coyotes. And then for avian predators, we have great horned owls and goshawks. But for the most part, the lynx is the most tightly linked to the changes in numbers, and much of what I talk about today will be about lynx and hares. Our study area at Kluane is a broad glacial valley, about 300 square kilometers in size. And within that area, we set our trapping grids, we follow the predators, and measure vegetation changes with these 10-year cycles. It looks like this most of the time. It is a winter wonderland out there. But for example, just today, my crew got up to a morning of about minus 40 degrees Celsius. And we're in the dead of winter, and clearly it can be extremely cold. And snow is a dominant player in this system. Very simple vegetation in the area. One species of conifer tree, white spruce, and really only two major understory plants, willow and birch. And it is these understory plants that the snowshoe hares live on, browsing on through the winter months when nothing else is growing. So our approach in the system was, as I pointed out, we wanted to tackle this cycle work by getting high quality demographic information, and we used mark recapture studies with live trapping to do that. Wanted to follow and determine causes of mortality, so we used radio telemetry to do that. So we collared hares and then followed their fates, but also measured the shrub biomass production and the hare offtake in each of the years going through these various cycles. But that provided us with basic empirical information. But on top of that, we wanted to see if we could actually perform any sorts of experiments to test the possible mechanisms that might be driving those demographic changes. But throughout, and particularly through the start of our work, the focus was on the snowshoe hare. And I'll show you how we shifted our ideas as we learned more about the system. But to start with, we were really focused on those snowshoe hares. So I say we live trap these guys on 35 to 60 hectare grids, about 80 traps on a grid. And very lovely little animals to handle. You run them into a burlap bag, keep their eyes covered, and they behave very nicely. And then we put an ear tag to follow individuals, and also put a radio transmitter on. And Charlie also said the reason he switched to snowshoe hares from voles is because the ear tags are bigger, and he was just having trouble as he was growing older reading the smaller tags. And ear tags for hares are lovely things to read if you have trouble with your eyesight. Okay, back to Lloyd Keith. He wrote this book about the 10-year cycle, but he also followed that up with some excellent work trying to do some of the very first and best work on the demography of the snowshoe hare cycle. And his work study sites were in sort of central Alberta, very close to where I currently live. And well within the distribution of the snowshoe hare that you see outlined in green here. But his system looked quite different than ours, but it formed the basis for us to try and tackle some of the issues around the snowshoe hare cycle. And he had a very simple working hypothesis for how these hare cycles could in fact operate. He thought it was a three-way interaction between the hare's food and the hare's predators. And he felt that the increase was stopped by food shortage. So as the densities of hares built up, density-dependent feedbacks led to they overbrowsed their forage, their food, their shrubs, particularly in winter. And that overbrowsing led to poor condition of the hares, cut back in reproduction, and a decrease in survival. So he viewed that this stopped the increase phase of the hare cycle. But once that happened, the predators, like the lynx, lagged behind, showed a time lag in the system because they clearly couldn't reproduce as rapidly as the hares during the increase. But once there was a slowdown in that reproduction and decrease in survival, the hares could, or the predators could then catch up to them, and they become much more important in the population decline phase of the cycle. And finally, once the vegetation had recovered because the hares had dropped so low and the predators had disappeared because they had no food to eat, the cycle would start back over and we'd see it repeat itself in another 10-year pattern. So those were the sort of basic ideas that we set out to try and test in this system. And you will notice again from what Charlie had to say with the vole work, quite different than the hypotheses he was working with in terms of social systems and interactions with extrinsic factors that you see in the vole cycle. So this was like a red flag, I think, being waved to Charlie to say, this is an extrinsic system being driven by these outside factors, nothing intrinsic going on. And so it was an obvious place to try and go and see if there was truly differences between the 10-year cycle here versus what you see in the vole cycle. So fast forward a little bit, I'll give you some quick results. So we have now 45 years of data, roughly 100,000 captures. And what we know for sure is that there's a 9 to 11 year periodicity, pretty consistent, about a 4-fold variation in peak densities between the lowest cycle peak and the highest peak that we've seen, and about a 20 to 40-fold change from low to high numbers in these cycles. So very striking big differences between these. As well, I think what we've been able to establish very clearly is that the demographic changes are very consistent from one cycle to the next. Predominantly, adult and juvenile survival are the key drivers of the changes in population size we see. And clearly at the peak and in the decline, this survival worsens considerably, and that then triggers the population decline. There is a reproductive component too, and certainly about having of reproduction in the decline phase relative to the increase. And we still don't know a lot about the low phase because our quality of data just remains low for that phase because there are just so few animals around to be able to get actual data on. So the variables driving that transition to the increase are still in debate. And we've got a paper that we've been working on that will come out, I hope, in the next little while, talking about some of the various ideas about that transition point. Okay, how about causes of mortality? Here again, very consistent story. We've collared over 3,000 hares so far now in our work. And the bottom line is that virtually every snowshoe hare that dies from predation. 75 to 90% in any given cycle or season, the losses are due to predation, the proximate cause. Starvation, and that's what Keith expected to see at the peak, just is not very frequent. You don't see it very often. So pointing more towards predators being more of a driver rather than this possible food shortage. And that is driven largely by the fact that all of the hare predators show a very strong numerical response. And so numerical response, I mean that is the change in the number of actual predators in the system. And here are the yellow are the hare density changes. And then we index our predator number changes by snow tracks. And that's what you see on the y-axis here. The red dots represent our calculations for lynx in any given year. And you can see they follow the nice 10-year cycle. They lag behind the maximum hare densities by roughly 1 year in most circumstances. And their magnitude of change is really very large as well. Not quite as large as the hares, but it's very strong anyway. But the kill rate by predators is a combination of two things, not only the numerical response, but what we call the functional response. And that's simply the number of kills of hares per day per predator, per lynx or per coyote. So what is an individual predator doing in terms of kill rate as you change the density of hares over the cycle? So here, each of these points represents a year, and we got this information from snow tracking, now quite old data, but still some of the very rare data to actually look at how kill rate changes as you change the density of prey in the system. And the takeaway is during low densities, they're killing under half a hare a day, each individual lynx, whereas in other periods of time when densities are higher, that can get well up above 1 hare per lynx per day. So basically a doubling of the kill rate by these predators as the densities of hares change. So both a functional and numerical response multiplied together produces what would in fact be the case in terms of the percentages of hares that are taken or killed by predators. And this is information obtained for us following cohorts of collared hares and looking at the kill rates, and you can see it changes considerably. This going up to the peak densities, the proportion being killed stays quite low, and then suddenly it flips around as you go into the decline phase and drive the hare numbers back down. This anti-clockwise sort of pattern is very characteristic of a delayed density dependent phenomena. And again, because of the lag of the lynx and predator reproduction and this functional response lag, you start to see the big effects start to take place once the decline is in fact taking place. So both a strong but lagged functional and numerical response and these sorts of changes can explain the changes in hare survival rates that we've seen over these cycles. So that's the empirical evidence. Just very quickly here, as far as Keith argued, did the increase get stopped by food shortage? Well, we didn't see any starvation. We saw limited overbrowsing, but we did see a reduction in reproduction, as Keith pointed out. Do the predators mop up in the decline? Absolutely. They can account for the survival decreases and possibly even play a big role in the stopping of the increase phase. Do the hares recover immediately when the vegetations come back and the predators are gone? Actually, no. The lag seems to continue for 1 to 2 to maybe even 3 years post when conditions appear to be favorable for hare recovery. So that's the empirical evidence. But if you look at this and think about it, this is all correlative. And Dennis Chitty, a mentor of Charlie, and a number of people have always pushed to me to say, we're not interested in what the proximate cause of mortality is. We need to know whether there's something else going on that makes these animals more vulnerable to predation. And that's the story. Is there some sort of compensation or interaction going on in this system that we missed by just looking at these empirical studies? And the way to get at that is by performing experimental tests to find out what in fact is going on by basically manipulating the key components of the system. And so we did that by adding high quality food to the hares, by trying to reduce predation. And then we actually also looked at an interaction effect between both the food and predation. So our experiments were big from our view, many orders of magnitude bigger than any vole sorts of experiments, just because of the size of the animals we were working with. So we replicated in some cases, but not others. This is a big field experiment, so experimental design was not perfect by any means, but on 100-hectare areas, we manipulated predation. We added knocked predation back and added food. And we also increased food supply on 35-hectare grids. So supplement their food, take away the predators, try and make life very good for snowshoe hares if the Keith hypothesis was correct. We also tried to do a bottom-up experiment where we tried to increase natural vegetation by fertilizing large areas of the boreal forest as well. And we did this over an entire cycle. Okay, so here's what the predator exclusion areas look like. Basically a fence that's got electrified wires on the outside coursing about 10,000 volts. If a lynx or a coyote put its nose on that, it would get zapped, so it wouldn't climb. And we did these over 1 kilometer areas. We actually tried to exclude avian predators from a section of this, but basically it was an unmitigated disaster and we couldn't pull that off, but at least we manipulated the terrestrial predators in the system. For the food addition, we did this year round, and we spread the food out onto these study grids, these trapping grids, and over the course of the 10-year cycle, we distributed 140,000 kilograms of laboratory rabbit chow, so a high protein, high quality diet for these snowshoe hares. And then the other treatment, as I pointed out, is we added food and we tried to keep these predators out in an interactive test of these ideas. And we did this over the 10 years, and that's outlined here by these 2 red dots. So some time ago now, but this is where we really did our core large-scale colony experiments. Some quick results. First of all, probably the most striking result was if you look at the ratio of the density changes in these different treatments relative to control. So this is just how much larger were the populations overall over the whole cycle on the treatment grids relative to controls. Value of 1 would mean no real difference between the two, and then this is just a multiplicative factor. So the bottom line is we couldn't have any fertilizer effect. Basically, the nutrient cycling and uptake is incredibly slow in the north, and so we didn't see anything there. We got a little bit of an increase in predator effect in the predator exposure, but it was not large, much higher in the food on 3, but the predator exclusion plus food had population sizes 10 times, an order of magnitude higher than what we saw on control areas. So clearly a suggestion that there's some sort of interactive effect going on. If you have a look at the adult survival, this key parameter that I said was a really important driver of the cycles, here's what you see. So this is, the bottom down here is the changes in hair densities. So a peak in roughly 1990, followed by the decline in low and recovery. And these are each of our treatment grids or study sites. So let's start with the controls. As pointed out, as you get to the peak, the survival of adults, same thing holds for juveniles, but of adults, basically drops off. And this value here, a 30-day, that's a 30% annual survival rate. That's about what we feel the hare population needs to have to be stable or increase. Any survival rates below that, you're going to see population decline. So they're going to start declining by these survival rates as you hear. And then 1 year into the crash, catastrophic drops in survival. Food did virtually the same thing. We were able to maintain survival for a short while, but then it just tanked and dropped down to even worse levels in the crash phase. The predator exposure area maintained good survival rates except for 1 year, the 1 year of the first decline, but before it recovered rapidly. And then finally, the actual duplicate predator exclusion and food addition maintained those survival rates up to levels that the hare population should have been able to maintain itself. So again, looks like an interactive effect of some sort, predation more important than food, which seemed to have little influence on this key parameter. If you look at all the population change information, here's what it boils down to. We got a 5-fold increase in density with food addition. Predator exclusion, particularly at the peak, showed no real difference between controls and the treatment, but a 10-fold increase in this dual treatment of predators away and food added. The crash, no delay with food addition, maybe 1 year with predator exclusion and 2 years with the double treatment. But maybe the most telling thing in some ways is this over here is we thought deep down that our treatments in the end would stop the hare cycle, that we'd be able to maintain numbers as the controls declined and keep numbers up. We could not do that. In every instance, no matter what treatment we applied, they all crashed and followed a 10-year cycle. So incredible, robust component in that this 10-year periodicity seems to hold even with these experimental treatments. Our overall conclusion was that these 10-year cycles are driven top-down by predators. I think all of our evidence pointed very strongly to predation being adequate to explain at least the stop and increase and the severe declines that we see. And we don't know what triggers the increase yet. We're still working on that. But for the most part, this is a predator story with a very small component of a food supplementation story. And you can find this nicely outlined, I think, in a book that we edited with all of the researchers contributing chapters about the various species in our system. And then we also have produced a more recent summary of the findings that we had in Journal of Animal Ecology. But I guess the conclusion from this is these large-scale experimental treatments are incredibly telling for how the system works, but man, you need to have strong commitment to what you're doing because there's all kinds of things that go wrong. And Carlos caught this when he came to UBC as a grad student and heard what we were up to and caught it in this lovely little cartoon showing basically when we did our early food additions, we ended up feeding bears and moose, and the poor little bunnies couldn't get to the feed, and everyone was tearing their hair out trying to figure out how to solve these problems. But if you persist, you actually can pull off these experiments, and they really pay big dividends when you do. All right, so that's kind of the first 20 years of our work. And you know, we had worked our tails off, and I must say that frankly, at the end of the big experiments and that, most of us, I think, decided to go pursue slightly different pathways. We just didn't have the heart to try and replicate our experiments to maintain those fences. We probably didn't think we could find the money. And so we entered into a little bit of a hiatus in terms of research. However, Rudy Boonstra continued along with Charlie to monitor these populations, but also developed some very innovative ideas about the potential reason for the cutback in reproduction you see in hares at the peak and for the low phase of the cycle related to chronic stress in these animals created by basically the fear from predation effects in the system. And I won't say any more about that, but Rudy, I'm sure, will give you some revelation of that in his talk next week. But things percolated along over this period, and as far as my career goes, I was busy doing things with red squirrels and caribou and that, but there were a number of our findings that continued to bug me that we just didn't quite make sense, didn't seem to jive with a total, complete understanding of the story. And a number of changes were taking place in terms of things that we could do in the system. And so around about 2014 or 15, I thought, could we pull together a team of researchers to take another kick at these hares when they went through the next cycle? And that's what I'm going to tell you about now in the last 15 minutes of the talk. So the questions that bugged me is, there seems to be a bit of a food-predator interaction, and what is the mechanism behind that? $1 million question, why can predators kill more per day, each predator kill more per day in the crash versus the increase phase? What changes in the hares that makes them more vulnerable to each predator out there? Talked a bit about this reproductive cutback. Why do we have this extended low? Why don't they recover immediately? And I always worried that maybe some of the results we got with the food addition studies may have been an artifact because of the high densities we created on these grids. And with the fact that we decided to do a press experiment where the food was continually supplied over the 10 years, we created these very unusually high densities of hares in the system. And I think it probably could have created some artifacts in our understanding. And you always worry about how repeatable your results are, given we'd only done these experiments in a single cycle. At the same time, there's been some beautiful, interesting developments in terms of tools we can use to study these systems. I call that biologging, to look at energetic expenditure, behavior. GPS collars now allow us to look at habitat selection and movement rates of these animals. And a big thing in the predator-prey world was this idea about non-consumptive predator effects. Can the landscape of fear, can the actual fear of being predated affect some of the demographics of animals that experience this? And the snowshoe hare has been used as an example by Rudy and a student of his, Michael Sharif, that suggests that this might be the case, that it's not just the direct killing that is the predator effect, but there's an indirect non-consumptive effect that we should worry about. Well, long story short, we pulled together the Kelowna Predator Prey team, a lovely joint effort with 5 PIs and all of a series of graduate students from 3 or 4 different universities, and just a fabulous team that put all of their efforts over the last 5 or 6 years into trying to get some more answers to these cycle questions. So a little bit about what we in fact have found in the last little while that is a little more up to date and is still in the works, but I'll give you a bit of the flavor. So for the snowshoe hares, we've equipped these animals now with a GPS antenna so we can get the locations, and a sophisticated accelerometer, plus a VHF tag. And so with both of these units, we can basically now use particularly the accelerometer data to determine activity patterns, like foraging, the amount of time vigilant, the amount of time they spend resting, as well as get spatial locations to know about home range size, travel distance, and habitat selection. So we've always talked about behavior changing in these animals or something going on, but in reality, we never had the tools prior to now to measure behavior in snowshoe hares. They're just too cryptic. Active at night, not in the day, just very, very difficult to follow. But suddenly with this new biologging and these new developments, we can start to really get on to some of these very interesting behavioral patterns that might be changing as the cycle goes on. As far as the lynx go, the predators go, same thing, GPS collars, an accelerometer, but we've added to it a little spy microphone to try and get audio pieces of information. And from these sorts of things, we can then look at when the lynx chases hares, when they make kills, and also even some conspecific interactions when these individuals talk to each other. And it's pretty darn neat. This comes from the spy mic, and let's just have a listen to what you could hear in these things. All quiet when the lynx is stalking or sitting waiting for the thing. Big change with the chase. And then the pièce de résistance. Often when these hares get killed, the poor little things scream. And so that helps identify, obviously, the species that's being killed. So it really opens up a lot of more detailed information that we can get off of these predators and the prey now, rather than just these very simple functional and numerical responses. When you combine both species, you suddenly now can get an idea of the frequency of encounters between the two. How do snowshoe hares behave following an unsuccessful chase event? And how do various conditions like snow, temperatures, etc., affect moonlight, affect the outcome of these encounters? And it really has opened up a really broad set of interesting things that we can look at. And here's just one example of it that looks at how these survival rates or mortality rates of the hares change with various winter conditions, particularly snow cover, and how that might be changing as the climate changes in our northern systems. For me, though, what I'm most excited about is suddenly we can now get daily kill rates for individual lynx. So this is just the average daily kill rate for individuals, and every one of these dots represents an individual we followed with either the accelerometer or the spy microphone for a 7-day period. So each one of these tells us over the 7 days how many different hares did they kill. And This is now over these 5 years of study. And if you look at the hair density changes, we've gone from late increase up to a peak in density, followed by now decline, decline down to very low levels and even lower levels in 2021 here. So suddenly we, instead of having those measly 9 points we worked so hard on to get this functional response in our other link cycle, we now have multiple measures of this and can start to ask questions about how the functional response actually changes with hair density. Do different individuals show the same functional response change, or are there some individuals that are just good hunters regardless of hair density? All kinds of things open up and allow us to explore these issues. So we've got lots to do with that, and the work is just in process now as we look at these various callers and the information starts to flow back in. But one of the things that really bugged me was this issue about why we really had such strange results in some ways with the food supplementation. And the addition we did was a population level one. We added over an entire area and gave access of some sort to the animals living on that area. But we really didn't understand any mechanism behind that. So I thought that maybe we could get at this in a better way if we thought about trying to supplement individuals rather than the entire population. And if we could do that, then we could measure those individuals that gained access to food, look at their body condition, how they foraged, their survival rates, and how they reproduced to see if there was any sort of interaction going on between food supply and the predation in the system. And this is Yasmin Marjak's PhD work, and she just graduated this past summer and is now writing this up. But here's how we fed individual hares. The hares we wanted to have food had a little pit tag on their collar, and that allowed them to open up these feeders, and they were trained to basically do that very quickly. And so right in the same population of hares, we had those that had the good life with food and those that didn't get access to the food but experienced all the same predation pressures, vegetation cover, etc. So let's look at what happened when we did this individual food add. Again, high protein laboratory rabbit chow being added. And these are Kaplan-Meier survival curves. Basically, think of it, we tagged maybe 20 plus food add individuals and had 20 plus control animals. And then we just followed their fate over time over the ensuing winter. This is all done through winter, starting in December, November, December, somewhere in there. This is the increase phase, peak, and the decline, first year and the second year of the decline. So overall, big differences in survival rate. So double the survival of individuals that received that additional food. Very striking differences in that increase. Not so strong in this peak, strong again here, but 2 years into the decline, virtually identical mortality rates, even with individuals that received food. So in some ways, I wanted to know if having this high quality food would make an individual snowshoe hare bulletproof to predation. And it helps them over time, but once the density of hares has declined and the predators are still abundant, it seems that even if they've got lots of food, they can't escape the jaws of these predators. But it also spins off into reproduction. And this is just the first litter. We didn't follow the other litters, but this is a very important litter in terms of overall population performance. And what you find is, again, the supplemented animals who lost this weight over winter, they spent, they basically didn't have to forage as much, and that they in fact produced leverets, particularly in the peak and decline phase, that were much larger in body size. So there was no change in litter size, but the quality of those youngsters produced, if you measure that by body size, seemed to be enhanced by providing that supplemental food. See the cycle though, in the sense that times are good even for control animals up into the peak, but then it starts to tank quite badly, and we could not maintain that performance even with this supplemental food. Even the food ad hares can produce smaller leverets as you move through into the decline phase. So what do we think the link is between resources and predation? We're pushing right now an idea that's been around quite a while, but we think the interaction comes about by predator-sensitive foraging. So when the predators get very high, the hares have to trade off foraging for protection from predation. So as the predation risk goes up, it forces hares to forage less in late winter. They lose more weight, and as a consequence, they also suffer lower survival and decrease their reproduction. And we're working on this manuscript right now. Hope to get it out in the next few weeks. So a quick run through, some ideas we feel we've nailed well, lots of ideas that remain. I think this snowshoe hare link system will have many unanswered questions that should be really fruitful study for graduate students going into the future. And we hope to be able to continue that with some of these young people that have been recruited into our project in the last little while as they want to go forward in their careers. Fascinating system, and one that now is getting easier and easier to study. So I just want to end by thanking some people. First of all, clearly Charlie for getting us rolling on this 10-year roller coaster of snowshoe hare work. He got us started and has been a champion throughout the entire phase of the work. And I have to thank Rudy as well for his proposing his provocative ideas and waving them in my face as a red flag to challenge the ideas I have and the ideas he has. And we're all way better as scientists for that as we continually question the sorts of results that we in fact get and what they mean to the system overall. Oh yes, and by all means, I have to thank my very good friend Carlos for inviting me and for setting this entire system up. We really appreciate having the opportunity to tell people about our work, and we look forward to more of it. Thanks everyone for listening to this talk today.
Thank you very much, Stan. It's pretty an amazing journey of both the cycle, the amazing natural phenomena, but also the journey of scientific understanding. Congratulations, a lot of congratulations from our viewers. We have people, at least the ones that have said hello. We have people from many states of Mexico, from the north in Baja California to the south in Campeche, many states saying hello. And we also have people from Dominican Republic, from Peru, from Nicaragua, and from Guatemala. Lots of congratulations, particularly because this research puts together two things that are pretty difficult. One is the long term, and other is the intensity of the work. It's not something light. It's a lot of intensive population data, as you mentioned from the beginning. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and then I'm picking up other questions from the crowd. Okay. I will start with, well, first, do you know of other research as long as and intensive as this, or is this going to be also a Guinness record? That's one, but also, how has this 45-year work has changed your spatial framework of the understanding of population ecology?
Yeah, so I'll start with the easy one, maybe. I think there certainly have been studies that have gone on as long as ours in terms of following populations. The red deer work obviously comes to mind. Many studies of long-lived seabirds sorts of things. But none of those studies have actually used experimental manipulations in addition to the empirical data collection. So I think we're pretty unique in that regard. I may be missing some other ones, but I can't think of any that have been this long. But it's a bit sobering to think that yes, we've been at it that long, but we still only have 5 replicates of the hair cycle, and many might view that as just too few to be able to draw much for general conclusions. So there's lots to be done yet, lots to be continued on in that regard. And as far as spatial scale goes, you've hit the nail on the head, Carlos, in that. And we really, I think, had mouse brain when we started this work. We had very tiny grids. We tried to expand that up to get more relevant to the snowshoe hare size. The lynx work for predators just creates an order of magnitude greater in scale that you have to deal with. And even though we thought our experiments were big scale, 1 square kilometer areas that we treated, that was still very small for the overall system. And that is part of the reason why we had the results we had with those big treatments. Even though we had them large, we really couldn't keep snowshoe hares on these grids when their numbers got high. They flooded out, they emigrated out of the areas, out of the fences, off the food grids where the predators helpfully lapped them up once they got outside the fences. And that's what led to the decline on the predator exclusion and the predator exclusion plus food areas. So the scale is crucial. The amazing thing about the hare cycles, though, is the very wide geographic synchrony, not across the entire country, but over hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. These populations are going up and down at the same time. So these animals do move about a lot, but in many cases, they don't move to anything different than what they're experiencing because of the synchrony of the cycle.
Yeah, that's amazing. I have some other questions here. Paco Francisco asks, do the non-lethal effects of different predators on snowshoe hare populations vary with each predator? That's one. I'm going to do it to, I guess, give you 2.
Okay.
And the other one is if the death is not caused by starvation, but the hares are weaker and are easier to catch by predators.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So it's very, very difficult to measure those non-lethal effects, and we've just started to get it indirectly with the lynx and the hares by trying to look at encounter rates between collared animals of both species, and that we again would have loved to actually do the same with coyotes, but we didn't have the funds, and they're much more difficult to work with than lynx are, harder to catch. So we really don't know. We do know that the mortalities caused by at least these 2 species differ considerably relative to time of day. The coyotes are largely taking hares in the daytime and not at night, whereas the lynx is a bit more of a mixture with a bit more predominance at nighttime. So there are some different things going on there. In terms of fear effects, we really just simply don't know. And the avian predation is very interesting too. Great horned owls were very big players in our earlier studies. We've had very few hares die due to owls in this last 5-year period of study that we've looked at. So quite a transition there for some reason that we don't know. So we don't understand much of that at all. And that's why indirect effects are so challenging, because it's just very difficult to measure them. As far as the interactive effect that you pointed out, I think that's probably partially what's going on, and we should be able to get at this now, i.e. maybe the predators kill more hares in the crash because the condition of the hares is poor, so they either have less physical stamina, so get caught easier, and or they may have to forage more because the resources are, per capita resources are poor, and that makes them more vulnerable to predators. But we hope to have the data with these biologging collars and that to maybe try and tease those things apart. Plus we have some body weights and condition measures of the hairs as well.
Okay. Another question from Emerenciano Rivera. He asks if predation rates are different with quality, with habitat quality. If you can tell high quality, well, you created high quality habitat in some ways, and if predation rates are different.
Yes. Well, a couple of things. I think everybody just is amazed at us because we rarely talk about habitat in our study. And so we put our study grids in forested conifer habitat. We don't put them in very open areas, but it's a fairly homogeneous world out there, at least in the area we study. So there are not these striking areas where there's really big differences. It's all hairs, largely in the conifer area with a little bit of expansion into shrubby areas. So that habitat quality thing is not such a big issue for where we do our studies. With the nice thing about with the individual based food ad is the fact that we didn't alter the densities of the hairs in the system. We didn't increase them, which I think happened in our population level food ads. And that high density of hairs, I think, attracted predators to the system. And that's why survival rates were so bad in our previous work. In this instance, at least we didn't change the habitat quality for the predators by increasing hair density. We had multiple feeders out, so hares didn't have to go to just one or two feeders. They could move around to get to feeders. And we put cameras on those feeders to try and know whether lynx started to learn where these feeders were and would spend all their time there. And for the most part, we didn't think they did that. But in the last year of the decline, I'll let this out of the bag, the hare visitation rate to the feeders dropped by 50%. So it could be that the predators started to queue into those feeders to try and go after these hares. And that might explain why those hare survival values went down to control levels in the second year of decline.
Yeah, it's so difficult to pull one thing and then everything gets entangled.
Yeah, that's right.
Just a final question, Stan, a little bit getting ahead of your next presentation. We heard from Charlie that basically the predators follow the declines, but they don't cause the declines in the 4-year cycles of bulls and lemmings. And here we are listening that predators have a big role, at least to push down the hares. And what can you tell us about the generalities? We simple-minded people like to think that the world runs one way, no? And predators have an effect. And I actually was telling Charlie about a lot of biologists justify the presence of predators by saying that they do a great favor by controlling different creatures.
Right.
And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so yeah, it's fascinating. I think the evidence continues to grow that the ability of predators to limit the densities of their prey, particularly in vertebrate systems, is pretty clear that they are an important limiting factor. The component around regulatory, i.e. that they can actually exert density dependent effects on the populations, and that is much more difficult and challenging to expose. And I'm not as convinced about that element of it. The other contrary thing, though, is the surprising thing is that when we took the predators out of the system, we didn't get a huge bump up in density of hares in that predator exclusion, suggesting that both food and predation in that snowshoe hare system were very close to being limited at the same time. So I think there's definitely some examples. You take even the Yellowstone elk in parks areas in North America, and that if you have no predators there because they can't access these individuals, the numbers go up considerably. So I think there's reasonable evidence to support some people making arguments that predators play quite an important role in terms of setting the top level densities of various prey species in the system.
Well, Dr. Stan Boutin, thank you for an amazing evening. You leave us a lot of things to think about, and we can watch you as many times as we want now. And we are ready for the next talk. In the next week is Rudy Boonstra's talk, and then at the end, in 2 weeks, we will have Stan Boutin again. And you can read the comments. Amazing talk. Thanks a ton. I love this talk, and thanks for answering my question. And people from Colombia also saying hello. So it's been great, Stan, and thank you for all your time and for being committed to share this research, this amazing story with everyone. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Carlos, and thanks to everyone who tuned in tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.